Hello, my name's Jane Lovell. I am the CEO of the Victorian Farmers Federation. I'd like to welcome you all in this evening to this webinar. And just to say that we've got over 200 registrations from across Victoria and Australia, which is another great attendance. I guess I'm a little sad that we're having to have another global supply chain disruption webinar so quickly. Andrew, you participated in our last one, and I think it was only a few months ago. So I don't actually want this to turn into a series, but anyway, this is where we find ourselves. So I just want to kick off also by saying that we are cognizant of the situation that's happening in the Ukraine, and that this webinar is being presented in a manner that is respectful to that situation. This is not meant to be looking for any way to capitalise on the unfortunate circumstances over there, but rather to stimulate a discussion and understanding of the potential impacts and how best for us to respond as farmers, as policymakers, as broader decision makers. The format for this evening's webinar will be a presentation by Andrew Whitelaw, and I'll introduce Andrew in a second. Then we'll have some questions, and then we'll have a presentation by John Blackburn, and we'll have some questions, and then I will do a wrap up and conclude the evening, and we will try to do that promptly at 8 o'clock. So first to Andrew. So Andrew has worked in large-scale grain and animal feed trading businesses in the UK and has been in Australia since 2010, working in the grains industry in both Western Australia and Victoria. He's a director of a commercial piggery and co-manager of Thomas Elder Markets. He's an experienced commodity market analyst, providing timely, relevant and concise data-driven insights. So as I said, Andrew did present at our first webinar on global supply chain disruption, and we thank him for coming back for a second go to talk to us about the current situation. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much for having me again. I'll just set up this screen share, if you just bear with me. I share the same thoughts as you have, that we only spoke about supply disruptions around about would have been October or September, and I think at that time we said it was the biggest disruption to supply chains since the Second World War, and it's only got worse since then. So let me just get this working. So who are we? We provide economic and market analysis with a focus on Aussie agriculture. We're one of the few to be truly independent. We don't provide anything other than insights. We don't buy grain. We don't sell grain. We don't do anything other than write reports, which are all complementary to the public. We do have to make a crust, so we do a lot of bespoke work for various people within the industry. And we cover all the major commodities from goats all the way through to fertilizer. So tonight, again, I follow the same as what we were saying before. The reality is this is a horrible situation, what is occurring in Ukraine, and we've all got friends in that sort of neck of the woods, and it's not something we want to capitalize on. So, but it is something that does, whether we capitalize on it or not, it does impact upon our markets, and its impacts upon economics and the margins of farmers within Australia and the wider world. So today we'll be talking about, well, what has so far been the impact of the current Ukrainian crisis on grains? What are the potential risks for food security around the world? And then a little bit on inputs and how this invasion of Russia is impacting upon inputs. So we'll get straight into it. Like, the first and foremost, the biggest impact we are seeing at the moment is in the grains market. This chart really goes to show just how rapid and how large the rise has been in grain prices during March. We can just see this line here. It is just such a rapid rise. You know, we're talking now in nominal terms, the highest wheat prices on futures levels, at least, and we'll come back to that in a minute, in history. And the majority of this rise has occurred off the back of Putin's invasion. There's not a huge number of factors driving the market other than that at the present. But I just wanted to highlight as well, and we're going to come back to this. If you look at these 4 pink dots that we've got on here, what we can see is the grain market has been characterized by a couple of distinct peaks where the market has really rapidly risen. And that's something I want to come across in a little while. But remember that. But definitely the overseas market is going absolutely crazy. It's been extremely volatile, the most volatile I think it's ever been since at least the 1970s. And that is something that is a concern for everyone. It does obviously provide opportunities for farmers. However, not necessarily yet in Australia. So we've just saw that really rapid rise in the futures values overseas. But when we look a little bit closer to home, we are not seeing a particularly large rise in grain values locally. Things are really sort of staying actually a little bit lower than the pricing levels were at harvest, but that is something that is not really flowing through to local physical prices. It is flowing through now to physical prices in the rest of the world, for instance in France, but not yet in Australia. So when we look, what we tend to look at and think is extremely important, and all farmers should be looking at this, is what is our relative value against the rest of the world. And when we look at this chart here, this goes back to 2010, and it shows our basis between our local APW price and Chicago wheat futures. Basis is an overcomplicated term, but it basically is just the difference between the physical price and the futures price. And the most obvious thing we can see is that we typically trade at a premium to overseas values. At the moment, we are trading at a historic discount. So at the moment, our wheat price is over $200 cheaper than Chicago futures on the spot market, whereas typically you would be talking about $40 a ton premium. So we can see that our relative value is eroding. A big reason for this is at the moment we've got a situation where the market cannot necessarily get all of its grain out of the country. We're already battling with a massive crop from last year. So if a trader, for instance, today was to, go and buy grain from you and then try and ship it out in a boat, he can't necessarily get a slot to put a boat in. So that is one of the difficulties we're facing, is that in reality, whilst the grain price has increased overseas and is increased in the futures market, in Australia at the moment, it's extremely hard for traders to capitalize on those gains, and therefore it's extremely hard for that to trickle down onto the marketplace. And this is also being seen just now at the moment. If we're looking forward to next harvest, we can see that the coming harvest has grown to a very large discount for Australian wheat. And that can be seen here again. And this is, I guess, a bit of more of a concern at the moment, because the reality is this is indicating a very large crop. It may be a big crop. We don't know. It's only March. It's a long way to go until we get to that point of the year. But it is a concern that at the moment farmers are basically heavily discounted. Whether it's new crop, whether it's old crop, they are very heavily discounted. So despite the concerns we're seeing in the world, that is not really flowing through. And it's important to remember that Russia effectively and Ukraine is out of the market now. So we've stripped away about 30% of the world's barley and 30% of the world's wheat and about 20% of the world's rapeseed or canola, which therefore means there's a big supply hole there which could be filled by us. However, we just can't get it out quick enough. So in that first chart where we looked at the rapid rise of the grain price, I mentioned that the grain price tends to be characterized by large peaks. We've seen some peaks in the pre-GFC, 96, 2011, and 2012. And what we can see is this chart here represents in the middle here, we can see this is the month where the grain price peaked. And we can see fairly rapid rises to that peak. But what we quite often see is in the month immediately after the peak, we have a very big crash. At times around about 20%, but definitely very strong crashes in at least 3 of those peak years. And as we can see at the moment, we've had an extremely rapid rise in March, way higher monthly rise than any other time in history. So I guess what we're looking at is history has told us that when it hits a peak, it tends to crash. At the moment, I'm not saying we've hit the peak. There's a lot of factors. We've not had a conflict like this involving two major grain producers in a long time. So we don't know if it's at the peak yet. We don't know if this is going to continue rising, if it's going to stay flat. But the word of warning I would have is that if this market is to basically drop, it can. As quickly as the market has risen, it can fall just as quickly. The big factor that would make that occur is if we see a ceasefire or an end to hostilities, we will see that market crash fairly quickly. So I guess it's just a case of got to keep a very close eye on this marketplace. So that's the grain picture, but it's not a great thing for society to have hugely inflated and hugely rapidly rising grain prices, because it's not necessarily sustainable. And as I mentioned before, Russia and Ukraine, 1/3 of the world's wheat. And when we look at this chart here, we can see this darker color is Russia, the lighter color is Ukraine. And I've just used Egypt as an example. They're supplying the majority of Egypt's wheat requirements over the last couple of years. And bearing in mind that Egypt is the largest importer of wheat in the world. So when you strip away that capacity to send wheat there, that has ramifications. It also has ramifications for other countries right throughout the Middle East and North Africa, because these are countries which have huge import requirements. So this chart shows the ratio of imports to production. So likes of Libya, for instance, requires many multiples of imports compared to its production. And this is a big concern because at the moment we've got a situation where Egypt has bought grain, and many of these countries have bought grain, but they cannot receive that grain because it's under force majeure. And when we get to these really inflated pricing levels, it may be good for farmers to have these sort of levels, but we're talking about people who are literally, no pun intended, on the breadline, so to speak. And so when we look at in the past, when the cereal price rises here, for instance, in the UK or Australia, it's not really going to affect us as citizens. If we go out to buy a loaf of Tip Top and it's gone up 10%, chances are we wouldn't even notice. But the reality is, in places like Egypt and the Middle East, bread prices have a huge bearing on inflation. So when we look at this chart, for instance, we pulled out some data on a number of food riots versus the FAO average food price. And when we see a large jump above the average food price, we see a corresponding rise in the number of food riots. So if we look at things like the Mexican taco protests in 2007, the Arab Spring, all of these are attributed quite heavily towards rising food prices, and that is what we're seeing at the moment. So it is a concern because we are already in a period where food inflation around the world has been exceedingly high due to COVID. So it's going to be I don't think there's any other option but to have some food security issues in the coming months, even if things were to get back to normal within the next couple of weeks. So agricultural inputs. The biggest input in agriculture is energy. And with Russia being a large exporter of basically every commodity you could think of, from coal to oil and gas to uranium to palladium to wheat to barley, it has a huge bearing then being locked out of the marketplace. So now we're seeing things like coal. Coal has gone absolutely through the roof, record levels. So whilst we in recent times there's been talk about removing coal power stations, it is still extremely important for the world's energy matrix. Hence why we're seeing prices hitting close to 450 US dollars a ton. The same can be seen with crude oil. We're seeing crude oil reaching peaks that we've not seen since at least 2004. And so that is another sign of risk. When there's a conflict, tends to be a lot of money going into oil because they tend to want to secure supplies. And the same can be seen with the gas price. The gas price has gone absolutely through the roof as well. It had, when I spoke to you guys back in September, we spoke a lot about the gas price, a lot about energy prices, and how it was so concerning when prices were around about 100. It's now 180, so that is even more scary, more worrying for us as farmers. And so we'll get a bit closer into it when we look at why we're saying that energy is the biggest agricultural input. To make fertilizer, you basically need energy. And this chart, it shows the Dutch gas price against the Middle Eastern urea price, and we can see a really close correlation between the two. So as gas prices rise, we would expect fertilizer prices to rise, especially things like commodities like urea. We're already starting to see that in Europe with plants sort of closing down, and this is off the back of already extremely high urea prices. So that is if a big concern is if this energy market doesn't get under control, then we are going to be paying, fertilizer companies are going to be paying more for their inputs, which will flow through to the price that the Australian farmer pays and the farmers in Brazil and everywhere else in the world. But Russia, as well as that, Russia is also a huge supplier of fertilizer to the world. So that is now effectively unavailable. So we add Russians' contribution to the world, and then also the fact that we don't have access to Chinese contributions. We're in a situation where the global supply for fertilizers is very much constrained, and that's again at a time where things have been already quite difficult. So it's not a good scene when it comes to fertilizer. In Australia, it's extremely hard to get access to pricing levels for fertilizer. So we do, I guess, our cost and freight model, which effectively is the price of purchasing plus freight to Australia plus discharge. The idea is it's to give a trend, and until there's something more transparent available from the industry, this will have to do. But we did see that fertilizer prices started to decline towards the end of 2021. And they were going in the right direction, and that was largely following the price of gas and energy around the world. However, old mate Putin, what he's done is effectively ramped up energy prices, reduced supply, and that has pushed things higher. And it's probably not quite as hard on DAP and MAP. We're seeing those prices have fallen from their highs in December, but they've kind of stayed a bit more stable, which is good. Problem is, most farmers have probably already paid for that starting fertilizer. It's the urea that's probably the bigger issue. And the obvious one, the one that we're probably feeling, anyone that's been to a petrol station in the last week is probably feeling it quite heavily at the moment, is diesel prices. We're now at record diesel prices, record petrol prices in Australia. This chart is the weekly average. The reality is it's probably more like it's getting closer to that $2 a litre, and that is a big concern as Fuel is obviously, especially for majority of people on here who are grain growers, fuel is one of the top three costs on farm, and we're just coming into seeding, and that is a big concern as we move forward, because we've got no choice. We can't really reduce our diesel usage. The other thing that's of concern that I was looking at today is that generally we have quite a narrow spread between crude oil and diesel. The reality is that the crude oil is probably a little bit ahead of diesel pricing at the moment, so we could see a bit of a rise again further next week if spreads return to normal. So fill up your ute at the moment if I was you. Again, I can't reiterate it more at all. Gas, coal, and crude is the driver of agriculture. Same goes to when we look at things like glyphosate. We see a very close relationship and a very close trend between glyphosate prices and gas. We see that it's a highly energy intensive process to make, and obviously with gas rising, it is a major concern. This chart only has data up to the end of December, but again, the same pattern we would expect. We've also had issues with glyphosate with Bayer, who's the world's largest producer, had a breakdown at their facilities or one of their suppliers, which has caused a 3-month hiatus in production. The reality is, in Australia, this is probably the only time we've been lucky in that we already had most of our supplies in the country or on its way, and also demand over the last couple of months has been probably lower in Australia than would be typically expected. So if that had occurred, if we had that supply shock in November, that would have been a major issue for us. So we've dodged a bullet, so to speak. But again, another input which is extremely high at the moment. And last but not least, it's not really anything to do with Putin, but I just wanted to depress you a bit more on what's happening with another input. One of the biggest inputs as well for a lot of farmers, especially in the fruit picking industry, is labour. This issue is not going away anytime soon. The reality is that in the last couple of years, we've had no backpackers. We've had no first year visas in 2020, which means that there's no second year visas. And up until the end of December, for the first 6 months of the financial year, we only had about 17,000 applications for visas against a full year annual average above 150,000. So we're not going to have many backpackers in the next couple of months, if not the next year. And I don't see that as being something that is going to be quick to return in the next, at least in the next couple of years. So that really was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what is happening with the Ukraine marketplace, what is happening to inputs, what is happening to grains. Can't reiterate enough, we don't really want to have high prices off the back of other people suffering. But to summarize, Australian farmers are not really getting all that much in the way of an advantage, a slight advantage in pricing, but we are suffering from the impact of higher input costs, largely attributed towards energy. So I've tried to keep it to the time limit. So if anyone's got any questions, I think there's a chat button at the side. And
there is. Thanks, Andrew. I might filter those if I can. So I've got 3 anonymous questions. So we might try and whiz through these. Which countries does Australia compete with, either Russia and or Ukraine, to send our wheat, barley and canola exports to?
Which countries do we compete with Russia and barley and canola exports? That's a good question, because it's quite distinct dependent on the year as well. So, for instance, we would be competing just now, if we still had access to China, our barley would be going into China, and we wouldn't really be competing all that much with them on barley. At the moment, because we don't have China, we are competing with Ukraine into Saudi Arabia. The reality is that it's more valuable to go into China for Ukrainian volumes than to go to China and then Saudi Arabia. So they're winning China, we're winning Saudi Arabia. Our canola largely it's into Europe. That's who we're competing with, and that's largely Ukraine that we're competing with on canola. With wheat, look, largely the wheat in Russia and Ukraine is going to the Middle East. It's going to Egypt. It's going to Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, those type of nations. And that is a country that they've got a geographic advantage in. And we haven't done all that much into that region for a long time. But
Okay.
they have competed with us during our drought. They did a lot of volume into Indonesia, so that has been something that they took away a lot of our sort of advantage in there, and so they do a bit into Indonesia and a bit into Asia, but largely we have different markets to a large extent when times are good.
Okay, so that we've got quite a few questions coming in now, Andrew. So I think the question about how will the conflict impact on fertiliser and chemical prices, I think you've covered that pretty well in your presentation. Why does the rise in input prices flow through to us farmers? Sorry, it's moving, but not the rise in wheat prices.
Yep. So basically, we do see a bit of a relationship between wheat prices and crude oil. We do see a relationship at times between fertilizer prices and wheat and corn, whether that's in the process of fertilizer, it's potentially more that they are seeing it as a capacity to pay, and so as grain prices increase, fertilizer increases. But the biggest concern at the moment for me is that we've got high input prices, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have high grain prices come harvest if things go belly up. But that's the answer. I'm not sure if I can really put a solid answer on why that is the case.
So there was a related question, I think from Lucy Gubbins, who said, why can't we get the grain out? What's causing the bottleneck?
Look, it's just a huge crop, massive crop. So the trade has bought every shipping stem it can. So basically, you've got to book a berth effectively. They've largely been booked. The grain's been sold in many cases, and so you can't just put a new one on. I do think the fact of the matter is that we're so heavily discounted, and there's such a large potential margin that is there, that there is a potential for people to find a way. If there's $300 on the table or $200 on the table, I'm sure we can find a way to get no more ships loaded. Might not be 5 million tons, might be 2 million tons, but as long as that can trickle down to the farmers, that's all that matters.
Steve Harrison has asked, do you think farmers actually realise how dependent they are on export markets?
I think they do now. I think the last 2 years will probably reiterate that. But in Australia especially, we've got a population of 25 million, and we are obviously export dependent for almost every commodity that we have.
Okay. Question from Toby, I think it might be Toby Campbell, sorry. What are your thoughts on the grain and energy prices on the cattle industry?
Look, I'm not all that knowledgeable on cattle. My colleague Matt would be able to answer that one. I can probably take that on notice. I sound like a politician there, but look, I couldn't answer that one. There is another question there that I wouldn't mind answering about the Aussie barley and China with the import duty, if that's okay.
Yeah,
I think this is a really interesting thing at the moment, and at the moment China has been purchasing huge volumes of grains in the last year. For instance, if you combine wheat, barley, canola, they imported over 50 million tons and over 12 million tons of barley last year. Typically, they would import less than 7 million tons of barley and less than 15 million tons of wheat, barley, and corn combined. So they clearly want feed. They've been spending more. It's cost them more by missing Australia. And now they don't have access to about 56% of the world's exportable surplus. So if they want their consumers to not be suffering from food inflation, then they should get to the sort of the negotiating table. And I think that's an opportunity for us to basically hopefully open that door again. Because for the Chinese people, having access to Australia as one of the world's largest exporters would assist them having lower prices, but at the same time would assist us getting higher prices. It could be a bit of a win-win, and that would be the sensible option in my view.
Thanks, Andrew. And I see Matt's come into the chat and answered some of the questions around feedlots, which is great. We've probably got time for, I'm just looking at my clock, we've probably got time for one more question. I don't know if there's any you particularly wanted to pick out, Andrew, or leave it to me to grab one for you.
I'll let you pick them. I can't quite see them actually.
All right, so I'm going to just change tack slightly. How do we further support our Pacific workers on the ground and in the community in all regions if we're not expecting an uptick in backpackers to assist our internal food security and food supply chains? Got any ideas on that? It's a question from Lisa.
Look, I'm not a policy expert in human relations or human resources or whatnot, but I think at the end of the day, we've got to support those workers as equally as we would support backpackers or any other workers. We've got to provide an environment that is safe, provides them with a good solid income, and treats them fairly, gives them good accommodation, good access to phone lines or whatever to phone home, good access to food, and good employment outcomes.
There's a couple of, because they've been reasonably quick answers, there's a couple of questions around if the war doesn't finish soon, do you think that the prices will continue to rise, get closer to the world price, and where do you see urea pricing heading?
Okay, so this is probably the key thing actually, and I probably should have mentioned this, is it all depends on the length of time and the severity. At the moment, things could return to normal fairly quickly if peace was restored quite soon. The longer it goes on, the more impact we have on the crop that's growing and the crop that's due to be planted, and also harvesting operations. So the longer it goes, the larger the impact will be. At the moment, the trade is working on, at some point, that Ukrainian crop will come onto the market that's growing just now. Most of the crop is winter wheat. But if it doesn't go on, if it doesn't get harvested, if there's all the 18 to 6-year-olds are fighting an insurgency or whatever else, and if there's bombings of the export ports, then that is taking away a third of the world's supply, and that will mean that it'll have to switch to here, and that should start flowing through. The longer it goes on, the more likely it is to impact Australian pricing levels.
And I think the tragic downside of that will be, as you explained to us, the impacts on food rights and not just food security, but actually global security, which is probably a pretty good segue to John Blackburn. So thank you very much, Andrew. There's one final thing. You might want to catch up with Charles Kay, who wants to buy some pig manure. I'll leave that.
Yeah, we've always got some for sale, Charles.
So thank you, Andrew. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, retired Air Vice Marshal John Blackburn. John's a fellow of the Institute of Regional Security and the Australian Institute of Energy. He has extensive experience across just about every field of security there is to be concerned about. But he also has experience in strategy, policy, planning, operational command, capability development and material acquisition. He is the board chair of the Institute of Integrated Economics Research. And this morning, in a warm-up for this presentation this evening, he actually had a chat on Sunrise. So quite a sought-after speaker on the topic. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks for the invitation. That experience is all fun and bit, but my experience in farming is incredibly limited. My sister and brother-in-law are dairy farmers just north of Elmore, and I did attempt to learn how to milk cows many years ago, and then I realised it is a lot safer and more comfortable to fly a fighter aeroplane than trying to milk cows. So I've kept away from that, but I've got their understanding of what some of the problems are. I'm going to talk about the Ukrainian war. Why are there some lessons coming out of this for our fuel security and our national resilience overall? So unless you're stuck somewhere in the middle of a flood and you can't see the internet, this last week has been fairly horrendous with the news that we're seeing. Everything from oil to gas prices to fertilizers to food security, and nations releasing 60 million barrels of oil amid the invasion, which actually is not going to make much difference at all. But let's now just step back beyond the last 2 weeks to the last 2 years. And what we can see is the pandemic has exposed a global lack of resilience caused by a collective failure to assess and act on national risks and vulnerabilities. So when you look at the Ukrainian war and what's happening now in the early stages, it's highlighted the risks of being energy dependent on a potential adversary, and also of a collective amount of naive assumptions that Europe, in fact, has been making about the relationship with Russia. When you look at Europeans' extensive gas and oil dependency, which limits their independence, it limits their ability to actually put measures onto Russia. They're controlled by a foreign nation in some ways. I'm also maintaining that we're very ill prepared for the growing range of threats that we're going to face in our region in the next few decades, which really affects our security and resilience. So what I'm talking about are things like climate change. Interesting to see the Farmers for Climate Action report that came out, I think, this week. We've got the issues of pandemics, and don't forget, this pandemic is not the nasty one, the really nasty one that people were predicting a couple of years ago. That's perhaps still to come. We've got the economic crisis that's been triggered by this. And as a result, global debt levels are very high. And whilst our public debt level is not high, we're back up there at the top of the private debt levels in the world. We've got supply chain disruptions that Andrew's been talking about, and they've been going on. We've got an energy transition that is not exactly going that well because it's become political. And now we've got conflict. And of course, the conflict's going to exacerbate supply chains, economic crisis, energy transition. One, I think the biggest challenges we're going to face is our political system, because you can't deal with these problems individually. It's a very complicated problem that our federal political system doesn't seem to be able to deal with at the moment. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the National Resilience Project I've been doing for the last 2 years, along with 250 other people. And that website link there is there if you want to go and see some of our reports. What we've been trying to look at is the resilience of our nation. And what we're seeing happen right now is a real warning sign to us about some resilience risks. So are we resilient enough? What we did is we took different parts of our society, from economy to health, agriculture, and energy, trade, research, and we wanted to understand how these are related to each other in terms of strategy or policy, and where our problems are. Now, it's really nice to be able to show this as a jigsaw, but the reality of what we've seen is there's nothing like that at all. Everything's done in an individual stovepipe. There's bits done here and there. There's a minister for this, a minister for that. There's departments. There is no integrated approach to these issues. And when you're facing complex challenges, that is a major risk to us and our sovereignty as a nation. Now, the reports, this is the integrating report, it actually sits on top of all the other part reports that we did in the year. And it really talks about Australia being a complacent nation, that our reactions are too little too late and often too short-sighted. I'll now zoom in on the agriculture supply chain issues to talk about here. And as I said, I don't have an agriculture background, but I started to look at these issues in the last 2 years. And certainly on the supply chain, I've been dealing with about 6 or 8 years. So if I look through the eyes of my sister and brother-in-law, what the issues have been on their mind in the past decade are things like fuels, fertilizers, farm machinery, vehicles, chemicals, and logistics. Now, as we'll talk about in a moment, we import 90% of our fuels. Fertilizers, huge amounts are coming in. Farm machinery, I understand there's disruptions happening thanks to some of the weather impacts in Northwest USA. Vehicles, well, we don't make those. Chemicals, there's a challenge. And logistics, as Andrew said, the global logistics system is impacting what we're doing here. Now, we can't be independent in any of these areas. So what we've been pushing is the idea of smart sovereignty. We need to identify in each of these areas what capacity we need to have in our country to allow us to manage a major crisis like we're facing now in the world. And we don't have that. However, we're still part of a trading system, and we will continue to be. So where there are critical supply chains, urea might be one of those, they have to be trusted. That means they're transparent and verifiable. So when we identify critical chains, we should not be accepting of doing trade with nations we cannot trust. And that comes back to the problem with Europe and Russia. They put far too much trust. And this faith in a rules-based world order, well, that doesn't work if two of the biggest countries, Russia and China, don't agree to play by the same rules. Underlying this, if you look through the agriculture, is maritime trade. In 2019, the Australian Navy Institute asked me to look at this because they wanted someone other than a Navy person to examine it. Well, when you look at maritime trade, 98% of all our trade by volume is maritime. And if you look at your sector, well, that's where it is. Imports in 2018 of machinery, mineral fuels, vehicles, and fertilizers, which affect you, were huge. 90% of our fuels are imported. More than 90% of our pharmaceuticals are imported. The fertilizer imports are interesting. And as we saw when China cut off high-grade urea, that immediately rolled through the problem with AdBlue, which, although the energy minister says he's managing it, is not going to go away. We're going to have more problems. On the export side, of course, same thing again. If you can't get the shipping, if the maritime system's not working, doesn't matter how much you produce, it's not going to go anywhere. When we think about this and risks, we've got to ask ourselves, what assumptions are we making in Australia? And remember what assumptions the Europeans have been making and say, okay, what could interrupt it? So these are the slides from 2019. Well, international conflict, China's BRI, terrorism, that's pretty obvious, and that is now happening. But the collateral damage you can get from an economic crisis where you get a loss of credit, an environmental crisis from climate change, well, we've seen that happen in Australia, including our north, south, and east, west transport, road, and rail lines. And back in 2019, we were saying, along with a lot of other people, if you have a significant pandemic, that will interrupt maritime trade. It could actually stop it, depending on how severe it is. As well, there's a big problem in our shipping system of ownership. What control do we have over this? You can go to the market, but do we actually have control over the ships? I'll talk about that in a moment. Who owns the trading companies? Who owns the ports? I mean, the Darwin port, leased to a Chinese company, has been talked about a lot, but the ports are such a critical function. We have to keep Australian control of that. So let's just talk about Australian shipping. This chart here shows the number of ships on the left, and by each country in blue is the number of flagships on their register in 2018. And in orange is the flag of convenience, where it might be somewhere in the Bahamas because it's cheaper to do it. Look at countries like China, 5,000. Switzerland doesn't have a coastline or a port, but it's got a lot of ships. And down here, if you've got a magnifying glass, you can see a very thin line, which is Australia. We had 34 ships, 2,000 tonnes and above, only 4 of which were capable of international trade. They were LNG tankers. So we're completely dependent on foreign-owned ships. So if you're dependent on foreign-owned shipping, including government-owned shipping, and you're dependent upon those same governments for energy, you've really got a bit of an independence problem coming up. Other countries like Finland take quite a different approach. What they say is maritime transport's key, and through subsidy, 40% of their foreign trade shipping is by Finnish vessels. But they also mandate stocks of fuel. Well, we don't do that until 2024. They mandate stocks of food. Well, we don't do that. And they mandate stocks of medicines. Well, we certainly don't do that. So why are we so different? What do we know that other countries don't know? And once again, think about what's happening with Europe and Ukraine. So the other thing back here is well, what is our national capabilities and resilience? Our national maritime capability is extremely limited. We don't take a stockholding approach. We've lost skill sets in the loss of that trading fleet. The Navy has only got a very limited capacity in terms of maritime trade route support. And our ability to mobilize our nation in a crisis like is happening in Ukraine, well, that's going to be a problem, because who looks at all of these things together in government and takes an integrated risk view? Well, there are various government reviews, but they're in stovepipes. Nobody's taking that overall view. So let's talk a little bit about fuel, because that's an important topic there. Our crude oil resources are small by world standards, and they're depleting at a faster rate than they're being replenished. So in the last 20 years, we've gone from importing 60% of our fuels, either as oil for refineries or fuel, and today we're more than 90%. We've gone from 7 refineries 10 years ago to 2 today, and the contracts with those refineries to keep them open and being subsidised by government are only valid to the end of 2027. When I spoke to the Energy Department a few years ago, they said they were happy to have no refineries at all in Australia because it's cheaper to import refined fuel. Keep it in the back of your mind when I come to the last piece. So again, what can we take out of Ukraine from this so far? the control of a major part of our energy system, and therefore our food production and our whole way of life, is not under our control. And the thing to think about, remember, we're buying lots of submarines, hopefully by the 2040s or 50s, because we're concerned about the Chinese government. And today the government announced it was going to increase the size of the Defence Force. Well, last year, 25% of our refined fuel imports for jet fuel and 15% of our refined diesel came from China. We're doing exactly the same thing the Europeans did. We're just assuming it's a commercial arrangement. We'll be right. There is no point in buying submarines and building a huge defence force if you have no control over your fuel. It's just pointless. Just to let you know what the figures are, I'm sure some of you have seen this. On the bottom line here is stock in days. Our diesel stocks have been bubbling around the last decade between 12 days, and that was in 2014 when Victoria had a fuel supply problem for diesel, to around about 21, 24 days. Doesn't change much. You will hear the Energy Minister talk about we have 80 days of net imports. What net imports is an accounting figure. We have a requirement as a member of the IEA to have 90 days of net imports. So what do we import? What do we export in terms of oil? And what does that mean in net days of usage? It's an accounting term which allows us to notionally release some stocks to the market in the event of a pricing crisis, like is happening now. We're the only IEM member country that doesn't meet our requirements. We were running around about 61 days. It's about 69. The last time we did a national energy security assessment in this country was 2011. You can't drive a tractor or a ute using this blue line. It's accounting data. You can only drive it with the orange line. Yet, a 2015 Senate inquiry into this was ignored by the government. A 2018 committee inquiry that tasked a fuel security review, well, it was action, but the Energy Minister won't release the results. And the Energy Minister's told the Energy Department to publish, when he publishes statistics, this figure. They add in the fuel stocks supposedly coming to us at sea and say we've got 89 days. The International Energy Agency doesn't allow us to count it because until you have it in Australia, you can't use it. So having said all that, what can we do about fuel and the problem here in the country? We've got a security risk, national security risk. We've got a transport industry emissions problem, and we've got a resilience problem. We will probably be 100% import dependent on fuel by the end of this decade because there's no way we can keep those current refineries alive. What do you do about it? Well, you've got to find some alternate source of fuel sources from in Australia. We'll still be importing fuels, but can we find some more things? There's a growing transport energy need in the next 2 decades. The government has no appetite to invest in infrastructure in the refining area, but small scale distributed production, whether it's biofuels, gas to liquids, small gas, latest generation oil refineries, which are being looked at, and some waste oil reprocessing will give us a little bit. It's not enough. So therefore you have to look at how do we reduce demand? And there's a combination of things, higher fuel efficiency standard, hybrid powertrains, that I think will get more and more important, particularly in the country. But we've got to think about transferring some of our logistics from road transport to more efficient energy modes, such as train and coastal shipping, if only we had the ships. And we need to go for a large scale adoption of renewable transport energy options, such as electric, green hydrogen and green ammonia. But this is going to take a long time to do. And it's going to be different to what we do in a city versus what you do in a country on a farm. There's not a single plan. But when you think about this transfer of what we're trying to do, we're essentially going to electrify significant parts into an electric system. At the same time, we're going to electrify more and more of industry, such as aluminium production, things like that, and steel and things like that. It's going to be electrification to produce things like green hydrogen. We're going to have to grow our electricity system 2- or 3-fold, and there is no coherent energy strategy or plan for this. The technology-led roadmap the Minister talks about is not a strategy or a plan. So when you come back to what a resilient society is, here's what we think. Aware of what the problem is, able to do a risk analysis, specifies the assumptions, and you can set a goal. You have to be able to work as a team, whether it's across state boundaries or industry and the community and government, but that needs trust. And you have to be able to prepare for a crisis, not just wait to react. In other words, we will mobilize. How have we gone during the pandemic? Shared awareness was terrible. There was a lot of stovepiped information and misinformation. Teaming looked like it was going to work with the National Cabinet, but that fell apart very quickly, where we ended up with the Prime Minister recently accusing the states of extorting him and the states also not being complementary. If you haven't got those two, there's no way that we can prepare as a nation. Now, this is grim, but I'm optimistic in one way. all the people we've dealt with in our project, amazing skill sets, amazing knowledge. We've got the expertise and resources in the country to do it. We're missing one thing: political leadership and a bit of backbone, because the federal political system's too near-term focused. So bottom line out of what I'm saying, we have no national security or resilience strategy. There's no current national energy strategy. We're going to have to do this risk assessment so that we can prepare for, better react when something happens, and adapt to the changing conditions. Where feasible, let's try and prevent some of these problems. Right now, we're running along reacting and saying, well, it's unprecedented. And the classic from Barnaby the other day was, well, you can't plan for something if it hasn't happened before. That's rubbish. So business as usual is not going to work. We need to think about mobilising our society. And as Farmers for Climate Change is starting to discuss, we need the farming community to say, hang on, this is not good enough. Because remember, the Energy Department said it's cheaper to import fuel rather than produce it. You've got this balance problem between national security and market forces and resilience. How many wake-up calls are we going to need? We're asleep at the wheel, and we've got to be more vocal about it. So with that, happy to take any questions.
Sorry, caught me by surprise, John. I've just taken myself off mute. So do we have some questions?
And no, I don't have any pick menu. It's all in camera.
I'm not sure that I'm seeing any. Anyone want to write a question? Oh, sorry, I've got the chat over the side. Okay. We're in shock. Terrifying. Thanks, John. Awesome. What about our vast oil and gas resources in Northern Australia?
Yeah. So we have quite a lot of oil resources there, but it's light sweet crude off the Northwest Shelf, and basically none of it comes into Australia. It's all exported. Two reasons now. We no longer have a refinery that can process light sweet crude. So when Altona refinery closed, couldn't process it. Oh, by the way, we haven't got any ships we can control to get the oil from the Northwest Shelf to any refineries, and we won't have refineries much longer. On the gas side of it, it's critical, but only West Australia has a gas reservation policy for domestic use. The rest of the states and territories don't, and there is a huge vulnerability. We have this resource, but we're selling it offshore. We're not thinking about how do we apply that resource to make sure that we're resilient as a nation, that we can do things, produce food, have logistics. And the politics of this has been there's so much pressure from the fossil fuel energy lobbies on politicians from both parties. They won't do anything. I've had this argument with energy ministers from both Labor and Liberal since 2012. They wouldn't move. Now, they're starting to realise it's got to such a mess. But we have all this resource, which we let largely foreign-owned companies extract, ship off, make a big profit, and then we just wear the results. Isn't that dumb?
I have to agree, but I will say on the upside that, albeit probably small fry compared to the scale of the problems that you've just elucidated for us, John, food security is a really critical topic for the VFF at the moment, and our President, Emma Germano, has been requesting of the state government that some kind of assessment actually be done around our preparedness and the whole food security of this state. And I understand from my conversation with you this morning that you're on the cusp of releasing a document or a report on that for the whole of the country.
I'm also co-founder of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. So this is ex-defence, civilian and military and government officials who are now retired so they can say what they think. We're talking about the impacts of climate. And so we're about to put out a report in the next 2 weeks about food security and climate. But you know what it is? I've been talking to people in Queensland about this. Food security and food production is so important. So it's for our own food security, but when we've got an excess capacity, it's not just about making money, it's about looking at how we can support regional countries like Indonesia and these other countries with their food needs in a crisis. Because if we don't, can you imagine how many millions of refugees will be leaving the country? And there is a big risk for Indonesia's food security in the future. So we need to think about food as a part of a national security requirement. It's what will help stabilize the region. And it's so important. And we don't think of it that way. We just think about, well, it's food for Australia and export. It's much more important than that.
I couldn't agree more on that. And I think the whole, to the point that Andrew, you made in your presentation about the connection between the price of bread, I think it was, and food riots. It's a real risk for this country. We need to make sure that we are contributing sensibly to the global food task, because alone, as you would know, John, our defence system is probably not going to save us. I have a question from Craig Dwyer. So what is the VFF lobby takeaway from this, John? And I think, Craig, what you're asking is, what should the VFF be doing around these sorts of issues? I've indicated that we have a few fuel security policies. We have policies on moving to electric vehicles. We are lobbying around getting this food security analysis done for Victoria. But what else should we be doing?
It comes back to teamwork. So you're aware of what some of the problems are, but food security is sitting in much a bigger problem. And the way to do that is how you team, obviously, with the whole Farmers Federation across Australia and the other states and territories. If you can get together, and this is what I've been arguing to the states, if you can get together and get over the competition bit that might be going on between state governments and say, right, as Australians, what's important for us to do to be able to have 10 years from now? And if we can get, for example, the whole farming community in Australia go, right, we can see all these problems now, it's not going to get any simpler for us. Putin's mad. We can't think about this rational. We've got really concerns about the Chinese government. We've got to say, how do we make ourselves more resilient? And I think farmers and country folks have to be a very strong voice in that, but you need to get together as a team and make sure that's the case. And look, I've got to tell you, I don't think the National Party does justice to the country folks. And I've been talking to members in that for ages. Again, because politics, the federal level, is quite a complex mess of business pressures. But it's, as I've seen with my brother-in-law and my sister, when you're at the coalface, you actually see the pain of a lot of this stuff. And when that fuel problem happened in 2014, the impact on the farmer was huge. But when I talk to the politicians, oh, it's only a couple of days, they don't think about a few $100,000 lost when you can't get the crop off because you haven't got diesel as significant. They don't understand a lot of this stuff. So I think it has to be a stronger voice from the actual people on the ground who experience it.
Appreciate that. And I think there are a number of other state farming organisations who've tuned in this evening. So there's a call for all of us to collaborate more strongly and more effectively. Look, we're at 7:58. I think here's one last question from Catherine Taylor. John, is there any strategic thinking going on at the federal level on biosecurity issues? So we've all been hearing recently about lumpy skin disease and how close that is. What's your take on that?
The interface I've had various times with Ag Department, yeah, they seem to be really focused on that. I mean, it's so food, this sort of biosecurity thing is so fundamental. If we mess that up, they've got a problem. So I think we're pretty focused on that. The challenge then comes is, how do you get the intelligence of what's happening around the place and where the threats are? As we've seen with coronavirus, by the time it's identified, it's already here. And so this is going to be more and more important, and it'll be a growing challenge for people like Border Force. We'll focus on airports and bringing people through there and how to control it. To the ports and how we manage this in the future is a really important issue. So I think it's on the map. How well it's coordinated across other departments, I wouldn't have the confidence of that, because our government doesn't work as a team.
And on that one, I'm on the Agriculture Minister's Biosecurity Futures Group, and we had a meeting this morning, and one of the points that came strongly from that is that biosecurity shouldn't be something that comes and goes with different colours of government. It should be sustainably funded into the future, because we do know that these risks are also not going to go away.
Look, we're a national security issue, and then you'll get a whole bunch of other people going, oh, this is important.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're bang on 8 o'clock. I did promise that we'd finish on time. I think that was it was a fascinating conversation and contribution by both Andrew and John. So I thank you so much for your time. It's not left me feeling cheery. Neither did the last time that we did this, but I think forewarned is forearmed, and it does give us an opportunity to do something. And I thank you both for your thoughts on how we could better work together as a team. I'd also like to particularly thank Annabelle McTeer, whose favourite movie must be Planes, Trains and Automobiles. She is our stellar senior policy advisor on all things infrastructure. And Annabelle took the concept of let's have a discussion around this and in a couple of days pulled together this webinar. So once again, brilliant effort, Annabelle, and just an example of the awesome team that is part of that makes up the VFF. So I just want to thank Annabelle again, thank Andrew and John, and thank all of the participants for coming along this evening. And look, I hope we're not doing a third one, but
we might do one about how things are going so well in a couple of years' time.
Let's do that. Let's schedule that for April, shall we?
Yeah, 2035.
Thanks, John. But thank you, everyone, and that's a wrap then.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Good night.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.